All right, so our repository is ready. Now, in order to use this in our controller, first we need to extract an interface from this class. Because we don't want our controller to be tightly coupled to this implementation, we want our controller to be coupled to an interface, not an implementation. Then in the future, if you want to write unit tests for a controller, we can inject a fake implementation of this repository into our controller. This fake repository is not going to use any framework to get data from a database, because in our unit tests, we don't want to be dependent on external resources like file system, database, web services, and so on. We want to work only with objects in memory. So here I need to extract an interface. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this, VS Code doesn't have the extract interface feature. If you're using Visual Studio, that's really easy. Right-click the class name and extract an interface. So here I need to do it manually. Back in the persistence folder, I'm going to add a new C# interface and call it iVehicle repository. Now I'm going to go in our repository implementation and copy the signature of this method into our interface. Now back in the repository, on the top, I'm going to say this class implements iVehicle repository. If you're not comfortable with the concept of interfaces, I highly recommend you to watch my C# intermediate course. There I have a section entirely on interfaces. Our interface is ready. Now we need to configure dependency injection. So we go to the startup class. You have seen this method before, configure services. Here we need to register our interfaces and their implementation with ASP.NET. So at runtime, when ASP.NET wants to create an instance of our controller, it knows what class it needs to instantiate. Now here we have three choices when registering our interface and its implementation. We can register them as transient, and that means during a request lifecycle, anytime a class needs an iRepository interface, ASP.NET is going to create a different instance of the repository implementation. The other option is to register them as singleton. And that means we'll have only a single instance of the repository implementation in the memory. And this is going to stay there for the lifetime of the application. And the third option is to register them as scoped. And that means only a single instance of the repository implementation will be created for the current scope, which means the lifetime of a request. So the next request that comes in, ASP.NET is going to create another instance of this repository implementation. Now, our repository is dependent upon our DB context. When we configure dependency injection for Entity Framework registers this DB context as scoped. So that means during the lifetime of a request, we'll have a single instance of a DB context. So that means if some objects are loaded in a DB context, they're going to stay there for the lifetime of a request. So if we query them again, Entity Framework is not going to talk to the database to bring these objects back in memory. So here we need to take the same approach when registering our repository interface and its implementation. We want to scope them to the current request. So back here, services.addScoped. This is a generic method with two generic parameters. The first one is the interface, so iVehicle repository. And the second is the implementation, vehicle repository. So with this, anywhere we add iVehicle repository to the constructor of a class, ASP.NET will create an instance of the vehicle repository. Okay? Now let's go to our vehicles controller. So currently we have two parameters, iMapper, which is our interface, and VigaDB context, which is a concrete implementation. We're going to come back and revisit this context here. But for now, let's add iVehicle repository as a parameter here. Call it repository. Let's initialize field from parameter. Beautiful. Now we go to our create action. So here's our fat query. I'm going to replace this with a call to our repository. Repository.getVehicle. And the ID is vehicle.id. Much cleaner, right? We need to apply the same change in the other two actions. So in update vehicle action, once again, repository.getVehicle, and we pass the ID here. And finally, in get vehicle action, one more time. And of course, we need to await this. So this is dependency injection.